Good afternoon and good morning to our West Coast participants. Thank you for joining today's ICD webinar, Executive Compensation Trends, Key Learnings in the 2020 Proxy Season. My name's Scott Munn. I'm a partner with Hugessen Consulting. I'm joined today with George Soiree, a partner in our Toronto office. The webinar today will run for about an hour with about 15 minutes of questions at the end. The folks on the end of the line are in listen-only mode. We will be recording today's event, and the recording will be available on the ICD website later today. We are also going to be referencing Hugessen's 2020 TSX 60 briefing, and so that should be available from download on your screen. It's also available on the Hugessen website, if you wish, at www.hugessen.com under the Resources tab. From a technical perspective, if you have any questions, please reach out to Kim Carthy. She's available at 416-593-7741, extension 289. So with all of that behind us, apologies for the administration. Let's begin. Pardon me, just working the screens here a bit, folks. Okay, our agenda today. First off, we're going to go through the TSX 60 findings from this year, so we'll look at the pay levels and trends. Then we're going to talk about the overarching theme of the increasing prevalence and importance of ESG. And of course, we're going to look at the repercussions, implications of COVID-19 on executive compensation. You'll find that many of these trends, while some of the information is based on large companies, it's applicable to mid-cap, private, crown corporations as well. Lastly, our panelists are going to respond to questions, so that'll be the last 15-minute component of today. I would ask that the folks listening in send us their questions during the course of the webinar as opposed to right at the very end. It does allow us to plan and respond a little bit better if we get the questions throughout. Let's just talk briefly about our participants today. So Sue McKenzie, I've known Sue for a long time. She's a director with Enerplus, Freehold, pardon me, I'll go to pictures so you guys can see everyone now, Precision Drilling, and most recently, Meg Energy. In your top left corner, pardon me, if it shows up the same for the folks watching, is Indira Samarasekera. She's a director of Magna, Bank of Nova Scotia, TC Energy, and Stelco. That's George in your bottom right and me in your bottom left. George and I have been partners together at Hugessen for, 12 years now, and I think the firm is entering its 15th year. We serve clients all over Canada and in North America, private, public, large, small. I think more than anything, some fairly complicated stuff. Joining us today is Lori Brotherton and Salam Tessagay from the ICD, and Matt Downey, who's one of the analysts with Hugessen, who is the author of the screens you're about to see. And of course, he's backed up by a Hugessen team that also did all the work on the TSX 60. So with the intros behind us, let's move on. Let's get into the data. So the TSX 60, pretty interesting set of findings this year. On a 5-year basis, you'll see the growth rates are in the 4%, 3% per year range, depending upon the cut that you're looking at. On your left is all the companies. It's only 59 companies because one firm didn't make our cutoff in terms of publication. If you look at the same constituents, so the same companies throughout the sample, it's the same pattern and the same incumbent, so that's the same CEO. It's about a 3% CAGR over the 4-year period with a 6% bump most recently. An interesting comment, CEO TDC increased 12% from 2018 to 2019, so we did have a bit of a bump in one of the samples. But as I said, overall, it's a more consistent outcome than in the past. Pardon me here, just dealing with a couple of different things. Sue, I'm going to pass this over to you. you probably have lots of commentary around how boards go about setting executive pay, your sort of thought process on the peer group, pay philosophy, etc. If you could share how boards are navigating today's environment, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, well, as you know, a key job of any board is determining how they'll position and pay, or as I like to say, make the important investment decisions on compensation for CEOs. And it starts, as you just pointed out, by defining a robust process and applying principles that generally are, at the risk of stating the obvious, grounding yourselves in your comp philosophy, in your compensation program intent, in the construct itself, the process that you generally follow, and then compensation policy. And it may sound a bit strict, but there are organizations that have policies around how they pay employees and where they start them, for example, and where they move them over, say, the next 3 years. And those also apply to new CEOs. So, building on the basic principles and that kind of foundation, taking stock of where you are in the corporate strategy. Are you business as usual, steady as she goes? Are you looking at a turnaround situation? Are you an organization in financial distress? And then, specifically when you think about how you attract new CEOs into an organization, thinking about the competitive environment for those skills. And, are you looking to prize someone out of an existing organization or versus promoting an internal candidate? And some of the internalities around that are internal equity, how you position the CEO pay. There's a piece actually in your Hugessen's recent thought piece that came out that shows, the ratio of CEO pay to the next highest NEO. And being very mindful of how you monitor or create those disparities is important. A really big gap between the CEO and the next in line may create succession plan challenges for you in the future. So you got to incorporate external feedback on things like say on pay when you look at compensation. And again, when you think about for a new CEO role, and as you just showed in your TSX data, it seems like new CEOs might be coming in at slightly lower pay quantum than their predecessors exited at. And part of that could be external feedback, but also track record and behaviors of new CEOs. And there's a whole other webinar we could have on how you figure that out, the behavior piece and what's important and how whether sign-on or keep whole payments are going to be needed to buy someone out of an organization. And for those who aren't aware of what those might be, that's to replace compensation someone might have been leaving on the table. So, Scott, we're throwing all of that into the mix. It's the job of the committees, the comp committees and the boards to sort their way through that, to analyze, to think about it, to stress test it, and to talk about it. And I always like to take a stab at writing the disclosure around the decisions that you're taking and you're about to make, to see how it lands, because that can often really crystallize the merits of the decisions that you're they matter. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. George, over to you.
You bet. We'll get the slides back up here. So we're going to break down some of the increases that occurred last year. And in this picture, you can see that while the median overall in the TSX 60 was 12%, there was quite a variation depending on which sector you're in. The energy sector, the bar chart on the left, had the highest increase year over year in CEO pay, but that you have to keep in mind that was off a depressed 18, so that's not that shocking. And over on the far right, financials overall were flat year over year. And I will point out just one interesting statistical thing. You'll see that we do present averages, and you'll see we present two averages. Why? Because BlackBerry 2 years ago granted a very significant multi-year grant to CEO Chen at the time, and it was over $100 million. So that kind of played around with the averages. So we back out the averages, and so the average increase overall was about 10%, not not a negative 12. And that's the head scratcher if you're wondering how that could possibly be. So let's just keep moving along here. I'm going to talk now about design of the programs last year and what did we observe? Well, in the short-term or annual bonus programs, the big picture is that we didn't see a lot of change year over year in how companies are structuring their annual bonus programs. No surprise, just about 70% are financial metrics, under 15% are operational metrics, then you got a flavor of some strategic metrics. So that's been quite consistent. The one thing I will point out is that on average, the weight of ESG metrics is at this point 6%. So we'll come back and speak more a little later on ESG, but it's interesting that there's a lot of talk, but right now it's only 6%. So then if we move along to LTIP and what happened in design last year on the LTIP front, again, not a massive change. What you see happening here is that a continued migration towards PSUs, so 52%, so we crossed the 50% threshold. So on average, 52% have PSUs in their LTIP. And the option stayed about steady, very close to 30%. And RSUs make up the balance. Within the PSUs, what we did see is an uptick in the number of metrics, and companies are trying to really align to take a balance between relative metrics. So people are quite familiar with that in a PSU, you would often have a relative, let's say TSR metric, but companies are also looking at adding other metrics, whether it's a growth metric or some other balance sheet metric, or it could be a return metric. So trying to align pay for performance through the PSU continues to be something that we see in the design of the programs. So moving along, a couple of interesting companies just to point out in terms of out of the ordinary or changes that they made. So we do talk a little bit about Synovus. Synovus decided in 19 to implement a special program, and it really says, look, in the next, at the time the stock was half, like they put a goal of $20 per share, and at the time that they implemented this program, the stock was less than half of that. And they basically said, for those who are eligible, you'll get a one-time cash payment that would be equivalent to a person's base salary, and anytime that the stock hits that $20 in the next 5 years. So an out of the ordinary award, in part due to retention, but also to complement their existing program. Very interesting. You don't see that all that often, but they felt the right circumstances were needed at the time to do that. Then there was Ovintiv, and what they did is they stayed more inside the box, but they did review their entire program. And the first thing they did is they did do away with the use of stock options. So it's not a massive trend. Companies are choosing to decide whether stock options stay in or not. But this one decided that it was time to get rid of stock options. And one feature that they did add here in their PSU is they kept a relative TSR test, again, very common. But they also said, by the way, if the absolute share price in a 3-year period goes down, even though maybe our relative total shareholder return is excellent, they're going to cap the multiplier at target. So it's an interesting feature to essentially, it's a cue to the shareholder saying, we will moderate payouts under our PSUs, even if on a relative basis we're very strong, but if our total performance to the shareholder is weak, we'll moderate the payout. So I'm wondering, maybe Indira, you could comment on your view on, if we take the Synovus example, but those companies that once in a while put in special plans, what's your take as a board member on the appropriateness of using special plans? And I'll make life easy for you. I'll ask the question outside of the context of the COVID. So in more normal times, what's your view on that?
So thank you, George. The Cenovus plan is very unusual because it's one time and very clear objectives, retention and incentive aligned to a medium term. What was interesting also, it was not for the president and CEO, but it was for the NEOs and for all employees. So that makes it interesting. Early payout 2022 up to 2024. So when I look at that, I step back and I said, that is board exercising discretion, but it is very bespoke and very out of the norm. So if you say, well, how should boards exercise discretion? There's before that, how do boards first of all incent value creation and retention? I mean, the standard tools are most boards aim at ensuring pay is competitive relative to peers, that the pay is well aligned with performance over the short, medium, and long term. And of course, you've described many of the tools. Cash bonus, PSU, stock options, and so on. So going back to the Cenovus, they've chosen to exercise discretion, and in fact, all boards have that option to exercise discretion. But I would say, in exercising discretion, you have to do it prudently and with some discipline. And I go back to Sue's point: is if you're doing this, think carefully about how you're going to position this in the proxy relative to what might be some standard tools. Why do you need this? Why aren't you using well-established tools? So that would be my observation with respect to those kinds of plans.
We do know also that it does get the attention of the institutional shareholders and the advisory groups, right? The use of special programs, so they're under more scrutiny than before. I think this year, when we get to COVID in a few minutes, it'll be a bit of a different story, but it is something to watch out for. Scott, back to you.
Thanks, George. So I'm just monitoring my mute button to try to cut down on any feedback. I'm just going to take a moment because we do have a couple of questions that have come in mostly around acronyms. So I'll take, if folks don't mind, 30 seconds to just go over some of the ones that we've used so far. The really common ones are RSU and PSU. So restricted stock unit and performance stock unit, respectively. A restricted stock unit essentially is a notional grant of shares. It tracks the value of the stock, usually on a stock exchange. It would include some credit for dividends where they're paid. And a performance share unit is the same thing. It just has a performance lever on it that allows for either a higher or lower number of shares to get paid depending upon how the company does. In the most common case would be relative to total return. So just for the audience, thought I'd fill that in. Let me talk briefly about our next slide here. There we go, just takes a second to load. So the next piece is really around best practice associated with proxy disclosure. And we got a few examples here. First Capital all the way down to TC Energy, and on a number of different categories that are particularly relevant to this webinar. I'm not going to go over each of them individually. What I will do is encourage the folks listening in to look up the Canadian Coalition for Good Governance document. It's the 2019 Best Practices for Proxy Disclosure. It usually comes out in the fall. There'll be another version, I'm guessing, this fall. And a couple of messages that go along with it is first of all, it's important to consistently evolve your disclosure. I think of disclosure as your first line of shareholder engagement, and it's a significant effort to get your message out to all shareholders. Of course, it should be done in plain language, easy to read, easy to follow, full of relevant information, and hopefully not complicated. And I'm saying that with a little bit of a smile on my face because I appreciate some of this stuff can be fairly complicated. It's important to make sure it flows. And I would say, from the perspective of working with clients on their proxy disclosure, you need to be mindful of the fact that it takes time. It usually have to start early to get it done well. And I think Sue made a comment earlier about trying to incorporate or think about your disclosure at the time you're making the decisions. And it's not bad to sort of start that drafting right after those decisions have been made. George, over to you.
Thank you, Scott. Just moving ahead now to, with proxy season almost done, we can look back and have a look at all the say on pay results. And yet again, in Canada, amongst the large companies where we have the results, you know, the average scores are very strong. And for those who aren't familiar with say on pay, it is a non-binding vote that shareholders essentially answer the question, do you agree or not with the way the company approached its compensation last year, yes or no? And so the average approval rate is well north of 90. Companies that get anywhere below 80 usually feel squeamish. And so if you're in the 70 or below category, you don't need to fail to start to wonder, geez, what is it either about our performance or our pay practices? And that's why we highlight the group, you know, starting at 70, 80% or below, you're starting to ask a few questions. There weren't that many fireworks this year in terms of public, newsworthy companies. However, last week, some of you may have seen that Bombardier was in the news because on this topic. It was reported that Glass Lewis, which is one of the proxy advisory firms, recommended against the say on pay vote, and they cited some pay practices issues. Interestingly, ISS recommended in favor. Now, when you see the result, which was 94% in favor, you might ask, okay, well, what was the big deal? And maybe there is no big deal, but if we remind ourselves that there are multiple voting shares at Bombardier, the family has 10 votes per share. If you we did our own estimating of what the underlying support was, and if you back out the impact of the multiple votes, we guesstimated, and this is an estimate, it's not, we don't have all the facts, but we estimated that there's actually 30% of the non-family shareholders that voted against these practices. So the point is that when you are a board member and you're, making pay decisions, the fact is your shareholders are going to have a say. So turning to some stories of some turnaround, on this slide, we point out 3 companies that had a weak result the year prior, and this year came back very strong. What's common here? They did something to address their pay program in response to either internal pressure or some input from shareholders. And how did they get input from shareholders? Well, they say that they went out and actually engaged with shareholders to hear and listen what's on their mind. And lo and behold, in early 20, they got much, much better score. So Sue, maybe I would turn to you and, whether you're a company that has had a tough say on pay score, or you want to avoid a say on a weak score, what advice do you have for board members out there on how to navigate that?
Yeah, well, George, maybe the best place for me to start is by sharing my own direct experience with one, shall we say, less than stellar say on pay outcome. And, the setup for this particular company is in the given year, ISS and Glass Lewis had both recommended for the approach to executive comp. The prior year's say on pay score had been 94%. Feedback that had been received on alignment of executive compensation with the shareholder experience had been exceptionally well received the year before. And since the company's inception of say on pay, and they had a number of year running record with it, had never scored less than 91%. So while 62% was not a failed vote, it was clearly a signal from shareholders that was received. And so, the question is, well, what do you do with that? So to your point earlier around some of the companies that had that experience this year, the first thing that we did, and best way to clarify a signal is to actually ask the shareholders And so we developed a shareholder engagement plan around that, researched who voted against and then targeted them with a laser. Their governance teams, by the way. And I will say that people need to manage their expectations. Sometimes your shareholders aren't quite as excited about talking to you as you are about talking to them. So, be prepared for rejection, but, establish what you want to accomplish through objectives. Define who's going to participate. Is it management and the board? And I will share with you that experience that I've had is that they really want to talk to the board. And they want to talk to the comp committee chair and the board chair, and with management not present. And so feeding that into a timeline, and then, preparing talking points, and that, it's really important that, you stick to script, know the talking points that you're trying to get across, and, and then follow up after the engagement and open up the lines, define a follow-up approach, and then listen really carefully to what you're told and ask probing and clarifying questions. So that's on the shareholder engagement side. On the proxy advisor side, if you've had a recommend against, or even if you've had a low say on pay on vote, and in the case of my company, they had supported it, it's worthwhile reaching out to them, because there will be an expectation, even if they voted for, that if you've had, as George pointed out, a squeamish say on pay vote, that the board has taken action to try and understand why that happened. And so step 3, after all of that engagement, consider actions. You've listened carefully, you've taken notes, you're considering what you've been told. You may need to look at changes, or desire to look at changes to compensation, improving your disclosure. And then, as appropriate, and when appropriate, communicate any board actions that you've taken. And so in the management information circular, for example, you might see in the letter to shareholders in the CD&A section, we heard you, we contacted a number of shareholders, we held X number of meetings, we listened carefully, we contemplated what we were told, and here's the actions that we took that you will see in this year's information circular. And so, having done that, it turns out that for, the 62% say on pay case that I'm familiar with, that the say on pay really had been about say on something else. And in its case, it was say on board size. Mm-hmm. And, the company's plan to address pending director retirements and board renewal were well underway. We all understood them, but to be candid, we probably hadn't done we knew we hadn't done a very good job of communicating them. So relatively easy fix to get out there to tell the story and communicate it in a way that investors understood. And so, and there was a happy ending, although it was say on pay, it's an annual renewal of happy endings, as you know, but the following year was at 94%.
It's interesting how over the last few years, the engagement by boards directly with shareholders has become, much more. It's very common among large cap companies. I'd say that within the mid cap companies and small cap, the whole notion that a board will go and directly speak with shareholders is still not yet, certainly not common. And many people ask, why would I talk to the shareholder? But I think the experience that you're clearly showing is that when done properly, it's a very good learning experience for the board, and you can make real meaningful difference. And shareholders don't bite, quite frankly. You get to hear what's on their mind. So we may come back to that if we have time in the question section. So I'll go back to now. We're going to close off essentially the part of the presentation that dealt with kind of the year in review, and now we're going to switch gears. And one of the special topics we wanted to address now is ESG. And in a few minutes, we'll talk about COVID. In terms of ESG, what we're all seeing everywhere in every industry is companies that are massively focused in their businesses on being much more mindful of the environment, of their customers, of their employees, and each company is focusing on the environmental, the social, and the governance, all three elements of ESG, in trying to run better businesses. Why are they doing it? because people, I think, fundamentally understand that to be a better company and to drive better results, if you pay attention to these things, it'll actually help in the long term. And also the shareholders are very much focused on putting pressure on boards to disclose their practices on ESG, et cetera. Now, one then asks, fair enough, what's the linkage to pay? So this is where we can say that there are lots of good intentions, and there are certainly in certain sectors a linkage to pay that has been going on for a few years. Example, safety metrics, customer satisfaction metrics. But the more weighty metrics of whether it's greenhouse gas or other big topics are not yet finding their way really into compensation. But I will point out 3 examples so that we all can look at leaders. TELUS, as an example, it actually identifies itself as the leading social capitalism company, which is very interesting. It's very much centered in its annual report and its proxy circular around all the good things it's trying to do for its customers and in the community. And what they did do is they have in their annual scorecard a 3% weighting on what they call sustainability metric, which is geared towards commitment to their community, brand awareness, and also some green initiatives. So yes, only 3%, but absolutely in the right direction. In a private company example, the Caisse de Dépôt a couple of years ago, they applied a multiplier, not just on their short-term program, but actually on their entire incentive program each year that is tied to that fund's objectives of reducing greenhouse gas emissions over time in their portfolio companies. So they took it very seriously, and it can impact pay 10, 20% or more. So now we'll see, we'll again come back to this a little later on, but now we talk about how about the social part. This is the one that historically has had probably the least visibility, but interestingly, in a COVID environment, all of us have seen many companies pivot towards the priority of employee safety, on priorities around customers, not just customer satisfaction, but customer safety and responsiveness. So we'll see over time kind of the license to operate part of this social element is going to have its effect, and we'll see very soon. And so maybe I will turn to Indira. Indira, where have you seen ESG start to manifest itself, and where do you think it's going in terms of comp plans?
So big topic, George. So just, as you said, pointed out, there have been ESG metrics in executive compensation for a long time in certain companies, but they were never labeled as such, right? So safety, for example, you're talking about safety. I mean, it's already been there, particularly in energy and manufacturing. It's been a big topic. The other one is environment, not climate change, but environmental compliance is a huge one in the energy and manufacturing sectors. And of course, we pointed out that customer experience and employee engagement, which I consider social, right, are increasingly in these things, as well as diversity and inclusion, I think are already in many executive compensation programs. I think the big one still remains the big E, environment, right? So let's just cover that a little bit. Some people are beginning to tie compensation to GHG emission reduction and energy efficiency. And I was looking at Alcoa, for example, has one of those, has that in their compensation scheme. But what these metrics generally haven't done is to deal with the financial sustainability issue around climate risks. And this is why, Larry Fink's letter to CEOs points very clearly to the task force on climate-related disclosures and starts to talk about getting companies to begin to do that seriously. And of course, I won't go into the task force recommendations, but people should really look at that. And the question I think that I think people are facing is that there are challenges here with the task force's recommendation One is a lack of standardized metrics around financial impacts. Two is industry specific. Now, I know the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board has begun to develop some very insightful industry specific metrics. And yet companies are still very challenged on this topic because while they are testing, some of them are testing scenarios for resilience in the long term around financial sustainability, companies who have responded to a survey are saying in some cases they can't reveal that because there are some confidential business information, example, around those resilience risks. And they're also saying there's insufficient clarity around the path to 2050 and the 2-degree scenario. So all this to say that inclusion of climate goals, specifically the financial risk component, in a compensation framework is very much early days and a work in progress. So that would be my commentary around that. And social, as I said to you, they have been included. I think the notion of employee safety, customer safety will get renewed attention. Some companies that previously didn't have it in their basket of metrics because of COVID-19 and the focus. And again, you'll need metrics before you figure out how to put them in compensation. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. It's a topic that is garnering significant attention. It will continue, I think, in the next few years, just generally. Right. I agree with you. The environmental will be massive. And I think we'll see this next spring, when it comes to proxy season, the social part will be on display, right, depending on what companies decide to do in 2020. Right. In terms of internal fairness, I think, and again, if we have time in the Q&A, we can come back to that. But it's a very interesting topic, and one that, unfortunately, no easy answer. So, Scott, I think back to you.
Thanks, George. Just going to jump into the third component of today's webinar, which is the forward-looking implications of COVID-19. And just in case I failed to say it earlier, Indira does need to leave 10 or 15 minutes early today, so it'll be Sue that's really heading the Q&A segment of today's webinar, and that's because Indira has a prior commitment with a board meeting that's starting very shortly thereafter. So let's jump into this segment. There's really a few components to it. We're going to talk about compensation cuts, performance measures, the link around government assistance. Perhaps if we have time, we'll see how that goes. The observation on executive talent management and some implications. And in this segment, we were fortunate enough to have the folks that listened in to take a look at some of the polling and give us a view around compensation and some of the changes that are happening. And let me just preface this next slide by saying that we've done some research with the with the TSX composite, and found that 57 Canadian public companies had identified pay cuts, and a certain number had also identified director compensation cuts. One question that keeps coming up is the permanence of those cuts. So with that intro, we have this polling question around for the current years where salary cuts, did salary cuts occur within senior management, or was director pay cut as a result of senior management? And we do have some answers to both of those questions. So among the group that submitted answers for today's webinar, they said that 75% of the organizations did not cut executive pay, so 25% did, and roughly the same cut director pay. Now, it's interesting because the relativity to that public company sample is a bit different, and I think that's probably a reflection of the sample of folks responding to the survey, which is a combination of not just public company folks, but also private company, Crown, not-for-profit, etc. And so that likely explains the slightly lower prevalence of cuts. So moving on, we have another question around pay reductions, which is, if your company did have a pay reduction, when do you expect to bring that pay reduction back? And here it's kind of interesting, and I'll try to do some math in my head here as I'm looking at the results. So if we're dealing with the roughly 30% that have a pay cut, or 25% that have a pay cut, I'll break it down as follows. Among that remaining group, let's say 15 to 20% expect to reevaluate the salary or reinstatement of salaries within 3 months. The same number would be after 1 year. And in between, the most prevalent answer, roughly 45, 50% would be to expecting to reevaluate it in 3 to 6 months. And then the remainder between 6 months and 1 year. So I'm going to maybe ask Indira to jump in on this one. I mean, any thoughts on the permanence of these salary cuts? And then Sue, if you have anything to add, please jump in.
So, I have not had direct experience. Maybe Sue can comment on that. I can talk a little bit about director pay cuts because I've been part of that.
Okay, why don't you start there?
And, one of the boards I'm on, we reduced director pay by 20% for the next 2 quarters. And we'll review in the 4th quarter. And I don't think it's permanent. I think, if the recovery is underway, I think we will begin to re-examine those cuts.
Yeah, and I guess I'd just add to that, Sue's personal view is that there really is no such thing as temporary, or even for that matter, permanent compensation adjustments. Just by their very nature, they're in place until they're not. And so, it is generally the work of the board and the committee to consider that at any time when you're thinking about adjusting pay, whether that's 3 months out, 2 quarters out, 6 months, and considering as you're doing that, what you normally do when you're considering pay adjustments, attraction, retention, and motivation of your employees and your executives, the business circumstances you find yourself in at the time, and the affordability, consistency with anything you may or may not have done in the past, differentiation between employees and executives or not. So to me, we're really talking about when and where will we contemplate off-cycle adjustments to pay, and whether those return those pay levels whole as bolus to pre-reduction is certainly, that's one of the outcomes, but there is an array of outcomes as well. And so, I think that's always the good work of the committee, the committee and the board, is making those kind of compensation decisions.
Great, thanks to both of you. George, I pass it back to you.
Thank you, Scott. We had another question that folks answered ahead of time, which was super. We got great participation on these questions. One of them was and let me just make sure this is popping up. One question was for the year ended, so 2019 because the COVID hit obviously here in Canada in March, and some companies had not yet paid out their 2019 bonuses. What fraction actually did impact those bonuses? Now, no surprise, only 20% said that there was an impact on last year's, bonus payout. So that was interesting. Now, I think we won't spend too much time today on it, but for those companies with let's say a March or an April year end, I think that the answer may be a bit different. But now let's turn to the fact that we're in the middle of 2020, and the fact is that most companies have a calendar year end, and they'd already approved their 2020 performance scorecard, and they already issued their LTIP. What do you do? And what we can say from surveys we've seen and across our own customer base is that most of the companies are in wait and see mode. They know that there's pressure on the scorecards, but there's pressure everywhere in the company, and nobody's making a decision right now because the certainty just isn't there. But they are turning they're turning their mind anyway towards the back end of the year, and they understand that it could very well be some discretion that might be on the table for, that may have to be exercised, and I emphasize may. It's not a certainty at all. So we'll wait and see. And I would say that it is capturing more attention at the board level and with the C-suite in terms of what to do beyond just what's been happening, at the broader employee base. So maybe I would again go back to Sue and Indira, and how are you thinking on your boards on middle of 2020 impact of COVID? How are you going to deal with compensation questions?
Yeah, good question. And I think, now that we're out of the sort of immediate crisis response focused on employee health and safety, we did sort of hold in abeyance. We knew there were going to be impacts on incentive programs, but, didn't make sense to put a lot of, legwork and arm work into that when, we really didn't have any visibility into how the second half of the year might pan out. So, we are turning our attention to that now. And it's important that we do that, setting principles and guidelines for how we're actually going to weave our way through the analysis of how to consider board discretion and resolution of how the incentive treatment will be done is going to be, it's important to start talking about that now and putting a framework in place. Communicating that to employees is important, and getting board and management alignment on what that framework is going to look like. There's full board discretion, there's partial board discretion, there's no board discretion, and that there's formulaic incentive plans that you need to address. There are ones that are far more strategic. So it's possible knock-on effects into what you decide this year for your treatment of 2020 and what that will mean for 2021. I think we all realize that the effects of COVID are likely extending well beyond this year. And so, but I would say also, George, that, this is in my view, precisely why board discretion is in place, is for events like COVID and the impact that they can have on all the well-intentioned goals and incentives that were set before it hit. And that, using that informed judgment and starting to think about it now and lay that groundwork now is both critical and necessary.
Sue gave a great answer. The only thing I would add is just to highlight that none of the boards that I'm on have had the discussion because we are still in the eye of the storm, and having it prematurely could be actually deleterious. So I suspect that it will be late August, early September, with an eye to looking at how the recovery is unfolding. And everything that Sue said is absolutely spot on in terms of the approach.
We had another polling question that people answered, and your responses are totally consistent, but in that polling response, 75% of the people on this webinar said that they were going to be likely or very likely looking at the pay programs because of COVID. So we'll see what that means, but this is going to be a big topic heading into the next few months. So Scott, I think we're going to, okay, Dear, you have to say goodbye.
Yeah, goodbye.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you participating. We understand you had to go.
Okay, thank you.
Back to me. So you know what, now we get into a segment here that is a cross-section of sort of talent management and board effectiveness. And I might, if you don't mind, Sue, just sort of direct a question. I think we had said that this might be for Indira, but it's really a comment on, how you see the board interaction evolving over the last few months, and any particular comments you have around the leadership of the executives during COVID.
Sure. Well, maybe starting with that, and the corporate leadership. I think it's been exemplary, certainly in the organizations that I have the privilege of working with, but also, in what I'm hearing anecdotally from others is, all of the emergency response planning that we do, the drills that we do, the assessments of business continuity have all been very, very helpful in helping leaders and more broadly corporations prepare for an event like this. And so, many leaders are leading through this in an untested way. Not I can't think of in recent memory impacts like this. And so, have moved, as you would expect, from a very command and control as it relates to employee health and safety and the critical incidents into being, more thoughtful about how we make, more long-term sustainable decisions around this going forward. I would say also that the board, has risen to the occasion in responsiveness, being used as a sounding board, using their experience, offline access, online access, very, very regular meetings, and in support of management and the management objectives, trying to make our way through this. And so, to me, I wrote down a couple of things that I thought were really important, and reinforced the importance of board oversight over human capital management, really, and there's a good reason why human capital management, talent management, and other things, HR, have evolved into many compensation committee mandates, and this has shown us, why that is, that, the board is interested in how the actions we're taking in response to COVID are consistent with the culture and the values of the organizations we're in, are being mindful of the employee experience, and the criticality of some of our key roles. I think I'd probably go on record as saying that we've discovered that some roles that we may not have highlighted as critical before actually have been, specifically as relate to IT. So it's been 4 months of learning, and there's more to come. But I would say that what we've seen is management teams and boards rise to the occasion as one team.
Great, thanks. So I've got a couple of other questions here. We also have some questions from the audience. So if you guys both have a chance to take a look at those. Sue, I'm going to piggyback on the last question, which is this broader question, sort of more forward looking. You get to the end of the year, you've got a team that's shown innovation, shown responsiveness, shown resiliency. How do you think of all that from an executive pay perspective in response to COVID?
Well, that's a good question, by the way. And I guess at the risk of being a bit provocative on an executive compensation webinar, I'd say, well, maybe it's not all about money, just for starters, is that, a lot, positive feedback and reinforcement and support goes a long way to, rewarding innovation and critical thinking, as we've had to use it on the fly, dance in the moment in response to COVID. But that, that's not to underplay, the efforts that are taken to ensure that happens. And so, we talked about board discretion at some length before. I doubt that, pandemic response innovativeness was on anybody's incentive scorecard, but I think, you'll see that it'll absolutely surface in discussion amongst other, let's call them strategic or less measurable items.
Right. Okay. There is a couple of questions from the audience that I'm just going to address out loud here. Some folks are asking, what's been the degree of salary cut or the degree of director pay cut? Mm-hmm. If you go to the Hugessen website and click on the big orange button that says COVID-19, one of the links there will be a spreadsheet that takes you through our analysis of those 57 companies, and you'll be able to see for yourself the raw data and pick out those that are most relevant to you. So another one is this question about how do you define ESG? What's a good ESG metric? How do you weave it into the comp plan? Maybe we stick with what's a good ESG metric.
Sure, and it's not exactly an easy question. I mean, the answer is, as always, in many things with comp, is it depends. And, and a good ESG metric starts with, starts with taking a look at your corporate strategy. defining what material ESG risks exist for you. And again, ESG typically is linked to financial performance and financial risk. And so it's really directed towards investors and the investments that they're making in your company. And so defining what is a material risk to you and your organization is the best place to start. And then sorting out from there, how do we measure that? How do we measure where we want to go with it? How do we define targets? And then how do we reward performance and moving the needle on it? So, as an example, Scott, as you know, I'm in the energy industry and I've spent 30 years there. And so, when we talk about in ESG, we're typically, broadly, nationally, that's not industry specific. We're talking about carbon. And so managing emissions, and first off, being able to accurately measure the emissions you have, define a target for reductions that you believe you need to and can make, and then measuring progress towards that. So either on absolute terms or on an intensity term. Another, material risk for many companies is how they manage and use water. And so, setting recycle or reduction targets, and then, making your path forward to make sure you hit them. And somehow those they're measurable, they're objective, and they can make it into an incentive plan.
Just a comment, it always strikes me that these ESG metrics, notably the environment and the social ones, are items that organizations have been doing for a long time. They haven't necessarily crept directly into a short-term incentive plan.
Correct.
And ESG provides a construct to think about some of these efforts. So I think about how a lot of natural resource companies, energy or otherwise, support the local communities in which they operate.
Yeah.
That's a big chunk of the S.
Yeah.
It just doesn't necessarily show up somewhere automatically, right? And it's frankly part of the culture of the organization, not necessarily an incentive.
Correct. Yeah.
George, I don't know if you want to take a crack at one of these. One of the questions is slide.
Just let me just pick. There's one here that came out that was very good. It dealt with the interplay between the board on the one hand, executives on the other, in the middle of COVID, and there are tough decisions, tough issues in front of everybody. Who's got the ball, and how much does the board lean in or try to lean in or lead on some of these versus is it management? And I'll invite you to make a comment on what you've seen across your board. But I can tell you across our suite of clients that it no matter what, the boards are working much more with management teams, more meetings, more effective touch points. And the vast majority of companies you've seen, the C-suite and the whole team rise to the occasion, and the boards are trying to be extremely helpful in lending their experience through other crises they've been through, and it's very much a joint effort. I've barely seen any tension. Actually, it's the opposite. It's more like people are dealing with these tough situations together. But Sue, what's been your experience?
Well, yes, George, and management is in charge and in control of the response. And when organizations fanned out to work from home, management was in the driver's seat and planning that, the protocols, the policies that were in place, engineering some of the solutions to it. Same with the return to office, the RTO work. It's clearly management imperative to do that. But what I will tell you is that the board's role is to understand the inputs that are going into the decisions that management are making, the data that they're using, how they're making the decisions to around the processes and protocols, how they're rolling it out, how they're taking care of themselves. The health and well-being of executive leadership teams who've been flat out in crisis response mode for 3 months should be of deep concern to the board, and I can tell you that it is in many, many cases. So, there's still a governance management divide, in board and executive interface and interaction in emergency response. That in a case like the one we're going through right now, Your board is interested, it's engaged, it's inquisitive, it's supportive, and it's doing its job still in oversight. So if that helps, the governance management divide still exists in my view, and that there's an active engagement from the board.
Thanks, folks. I'm going to move to close because I'm not sure what happens if we go too much over an hour. I am going to say, Sue, that was a great wrap up and commentary. Really appreciate it, because it's funny. 2019 was a bit of a sleeper year for compensation. I think 2020 may go down in the books as one of the most stressful, interesting, depending upon which side of the debate you're on, around compensation. And all the best practices that the ICD talks around compensation and governance and how board and management work together, and discretion and judgment and goal setting, it all comes to the forefront here. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the balance of the year plays out. I know we get a chance to revisit this in November, so that'll be kind of fun to see where we're at. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. We are at time. Special thanks to Sue, to Indira, to George, Matt, who pulled together the slides, Lori and Salam, who did their best to help us with the technology and get this whole thing marketed and out there for the public to find. The ICD is always a wonderful partner. It's really greatly appreciated. We hope you've enjoyed today's session. You will find it on the ICD website. The recording will be there for you. If you have questions, please reach out to us. For those of you that ask questions that we didn't get to, we will do our best to get an answer back to you. And that's it. On behalf of Hugessen, thanks to Sue and Indira in particular, and to the ICD. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye, everybody.